In this video, we're going to look at how we absorb nutrients from the lumen of the small intestine into either the bloodstream or the lymphatic vessel. In the last video, we looked at how we use digestive enzymes to chemically break down our macromolecules, our carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids. And then those small building blocks are what we'll be absorbing across the membrane. So food is going to leave the stomach and go into the small intestine, where we're going to have chemical and mechanical digestion. When we look inside the small intestine, we can see lots of villi. If we zoom into a single villus, we can see that every villus has a capillary and a lymphatic vessel, and this is where our nutrients will be absorbed into the bloodstream. Now we'll zoom into one individual villus, and then we're going to look at an individual epithelial cell. And we'll look at how things move across the membrane. Here we can see an individual villus with a lymphatic vessel and a capillary. So nutrients are going to absorb through the individual epithelial cells into either of these two vessels. Now, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to focus specifically on the epithelial cells and how things move from the lumen of the digestive tract, which is out here, and how they move into these cells and out the other side. When we look at how nutrients move across the membrane, recall from a previous video, I put the link down in the description below if you want to refresh your memory, but we have different ways that things can cross a membrane. They can cross through simple diffusion, meaning they can just move across the membrane down their concentration gradient, or they can use facilitated transport, where they need to use a membrane protein, either a carrier or a channel, to be able to get across the membrane. And then we also have active transport, where energy is required to move that molecule across the membrane. First, we'll have a look at our sugars. We have glucose, galactose, and fructose. Glucose and galactose will move across the membrane on the apical side. This is the lumen side, so this is where our nutrients are. Glucose and galactose are going to move through facilitated transport using a sodium gradient. Glucose and galactose will be carried across the membrane with sodium using a co-transporter. Fructose, on the other hand, will use a carrier protein. So it will bind to the protein, it will change its conformational shape, and it will move fructose inside the cell. So that's how we move our sugars into the cell. Once the sugars are inside the cell, now it has to leave the basolateral side, and it will use a carrier protein. So for all of the movement of sugars across both membranes, we need to use facilitated transport. Now the sodium that has moved across the membrane, if we don't move that back out, it will build up in concentration. So over here on the basolateral side, we use the sodium-potassium pump. And energy is required, so this is active transport. So potassium will come in and sodium will go out. And then potassium and other ions also, which is not shown in this particular slide, but ions will also have membrane channels, and they will move across the membrane, and they will eventually go into the bloodstream. Nucleic acids move exactly the same way as glucose and galactose. They will use a sodium co-transporter. So the nucleotides and the sodium bind, and the sodium gradient is used as energy. So we do not need ATP to move these molecules. Once the nucleotides are inside the cell, again, they will leave the basolateral side with a carrier protein. I want to point out that both sugars and nucleotides have to be completely broken down into their individual building blocks as either glucose, galactose, fructose, or adenine, cytosine, guanine, etc. They have to be in their building blocks to be able to bind to those membrane proteins to be able to move across the membrane. So for example, sucrose, which is our table sugar, that is a disaccharide, and that is composed of glucose and fructose stuck together. Sucrose cannot cross the membrane. It has to be broken down and digested into glucose and fructose individually. So another example is lactose, which is our milk sugar. it is composed of glucose and galactose. It's a disaccharide. If we do not break lactose down into its individual monomers, we cannot absorb it. And this happens in the case of people with lactose intolerance. That means they are not producing lactase, the enzyme that will digest it. So then that lactose sugar will stay in the lumen of the digestive tract. And then this is what will contribute to symptoms of lactose intolerance, because the sugar stays in the intestine. It will work its way down to the large intestine where we have gut bacteria, and then those bacteria will start to digest the lactose. And then when they do that, they produce gas, and it increases the volume of your large intestine. It gives you diarrhea and all of the different kinds of symptoms that go with lactose intolerance. With proteins have to be broken down into peptides, and then into smaller peptides, and then into individual amino acids. However, we can absorb small peptides. So proteins don't have to be completely broken down into individual amino acids. When we are absorbing individual amino acids, they will also co-transport with sodium, just like glucose, galactose, and our nucleotides. They will move across the membrane. We do not require ATP. They're moving down their concentration gradient. But we can actually also absorb small peptides. Anywhere from 3 to 8 amino acids can still move across the membrane. It will use facilitated transport, but in this case, it is going to use a hydrogen co-transporter. And now with the sodium, again, the sodium is going to leave through the sodium-potassium pump on the basolateral side, and the hydrogen will just pump itself back out of the membrane, and the hydrogen can be recycled. So then we use this gradient, and then we can absorb small peptides. Then they should technically be broken down completely into amino acids inside the epithelial cell, and then again, they will use facilitated transport, a carrier protein, on the basolateral side of the membrane to move out, and then they will move into the bloodstream. However, sometimes these small peptides are not actually completely broken down, and they can get into the bloodstream. Now, I want to point this out because this is why we can have food allergies. So an intolerance and an allergy is different. An intolerance means that you haven't been able to break down that nutrient, like lactose, whereas an allergy means you're stimulating the immune system to react to that molecule. So let's suppose you have a peanut allergy and you don't completely break down the peanuts into individual amino acids. Peptides that move across the membrane and get into the bloodstream can act as an antigen. And that means the immune system can attack it and you can have an allergic reaction. Next, we will look at how we move ions and water across the membrane. Water can move in 3 different ways. Okay, so number 1, water can move in between our epithelial cells, and this is called paracellular transport. Water can also move into the cell and then out of the cell. This is osmosis, and that is called transcellular transport. And then lastly, water can move through membrane proteins. These membrane proteins are called aquaporins. Now, ions can move across the membrane, either co-transporting or through their own individual channels, which are not shown here. For example, we can have a potassium channel or a chloride channel, and these ions can move through channels across the membrane. And that would be the same on the basolateral side. Now, there's 2 ions that I want to just mention briefly. One is magnesium, which is very important for helping muscles and the nervous system to relax. Magnesium can cross the membrane either through an ion channel, or it can cross in between cells. So I guess it's not crossing a membrane. It can move through the cell, or it can move between the cells. So magnesium can be paracellular or transcellular transport. And then the last one I want to mention is calcium. Calcium can move in between cells as well, and it can only move through the cell, transcellular transport, when we have vitamin D. Vitamin D is important for activating the membrane channel that will move calcium. So if you're vitamin D deficient, you can also be calcium deficient. Now, lastly, we're going to look at fat absorption. Fat absorption is a little bit more complicated. So remember in the last video, we talked about how we use bile to emulsify large fat droplets into small fat droplets. Then those fat droplets have to be chemically digested with the enzyme lipase. Now, when we digest fats, we're going to end up with glycerol molecules and fatty acids, and sometimes a monoglyceride, which means the glycerol and one fatty acid chain stay stuck together. Now, fats are fat soluble, and so they can cross the membrane through simple diffusion. They do not need a membrane protein. Over here, we have our fat droplet, and it is coated in the bile salts that have a non-polar side that is attached to the fat and a polar side that is mixing with water. And as we break down these big fat droplets into smaller fat droplets, then we can use lipase to actually chemically break these triglycerides into monoglycerides and fatty acids. Now, these individual broken down building blocks will stay in very, very small droplets called micelles. Now, these can simply diffuse across the membrane. They do not need a membrane protein. Once these fats have diffused into the epithelial cell, now it is a little bit different from the other nutrients. We are going to use the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Remember, in the cells, the rough endoplasmic reticulum produces proteins, and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum can produce fats. So now we take these building blocks and we reform the triglycerides. Once we reform those, they are going to group together along with other fat-soluble molecules, and that includes cholesterol and phospholipids. If you eat plant and animal cells, you're eating phospholipids, which is the same phospholipids that make up our cell membranes. And then also fat-soluble vitamins. So vitamin A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble. They will also absorb in the same way as fat molecules. So then we are going to put all of those fat molecules together into this larger molecule called a chylomicron. Now, chylomicrons are multiple molecules, and they're too large to move across the membrane through a transport protein. So these molecules leave the cell through exocytosis. And then these molecules are not going to go into the bloodstream. They are going to go into a lymphatic vessel. Then it is going to move from the lymphatic vessel into the circulatory system, either through the left subclavian vein or the thoracic duct. Then it will travel to the liver. And here the liver will make LDL molecules, low density lipoproteins, that will carry the triglycerides through the bloodstream to the adipose tissue where we store fat. Also, as those LDL molecules, which are fairly large molecules carrying fat molecules, also phospholipids and cholesterol, any cell that has an LDL receptor can take up those fat molecules, and then that cell can use those fats for energy. We can use fat, break it down, and make ATP. Now, the other molecules that we talked about are going to go directly into the bloodstream. Amino acids, very small short-chain fatty acids, can actually also go into the bloodstream. Monosaccharides are sugars, okay, and are nucleotides. They will go into the bloodstream. Now, those nutrients are going to travel directly to the liver through the hepatic portal vein, and then the liver is going to sort and organize those nutrients, and then the liver will figure out what is going to stay in the bloodstream for the body to use so that we're regulating our blood sugar, and what nutrients and molecules are going to stay in the liver and be stored for later. One last thing that I want to mention about the small intestine is vitamin B12. Remember, in a previous video, we talked about how the stomach produces intrinsic factor. intrinsic factor is required to bind with vitamin B12, and then that will help vitamin B12 absorb into the bloodstream. And this occurs in the ileum, which is the last portion of the small intestine. If we do not make intrinsic factor, we cannot absorb vitamin B12, and you can become B12 deficient. And that can lead to all kinds of problems. One of the main things is we use B12 to make red blood cells. So without B12, you can become anemic. Now, I want to talk about a very interesting aspect of our digestive tract and our absorption. And that is what I've just described is how your intestine works when everything is perfectly healthy and everything is running very smoothly and exactly the way that it's supposed to. But not everybody is 100% healthy all the time, right? So there's different kinds of factors that can affect how our intestine absorbs food. And there are periods of time when we can have inflammatory reactions or too many toxins or, the intestine cells are not functioning perfectly properly. So one thing that I want to talk about is called intestinal permeability. And sometimes we can have hyperpermeability or increased permeability, and this is sometimes called leaky gut syndrome. Now, what can happen is nutrients that are not completely digested could get across and into the bloodstream. And how does that happen? So let's have a look at our intestinal lining. So I made this diagram where we have a row of epithelial cells. Our whole digestive system, all of the villi, are a single layer of epithelial cells. So we have our large nutrients, or partially digested food molecules, and then we break them down into building blocks, like a glucose molecule, and then it has to cross into the cell, and then it has to cross out, and then it goes into the bloodstream. Now, nutrients should be fully broken down and go into the cell and out the other side and into the blood. And we have a barrier. In between all of our epithelial cells, we have tight junctions. And these are proteins that hold these cells together very tightly. So things except water and some ions should not be able to move in between cells. Like this large molecule here should not be able to get into the bloodstream. But because this is a single layer, it can sometimes get damaged. I also want to point out that we have goblet cells that produce mucus, and this helps to protect the layer of intestinal cells. But if we have too much mucus, then we will have a harder time absorbing nutrients. So this side over here is the healthy side. This is what it should look like. We should have some mucus, nutrients should be broken down, and they should cross the membranes and then get into the blood. Over here, we have inflammation. Now, what has happened here is some of the epithelial cells have been damaged, and little bits of this is normal. It is normal to have a little bit of breakdown of our epithelial cells, and we replace them very quickly and very frequently. But if we have lots of damage for a long period of time, then we're going to have an inflammatory response. That means that our lining has gaps, and that means undigested molecules can get into the bloodstream and into the tissue surrounding the blood vessels. The other thing that can happen is we can produce excess mucus, which means nutrients have a much harder time being absorbed. When we have damage and we have undigested molecules getting through the epithelial layer, we are going to stimulate the immune system like macrophages and neutrophils. Then this whole area is going to become inflamed. So having a damaged intestinal lining plays a huge role in all kinds of inflammatory conditions. It will increase allergies, it will increase food sensitivities, it will affect your ability to digest food, and you'll feel indigestion, maybe cramping, maybe bloating, all of those kinds of ineffective digestive mechanisms. You're going to start to notice symptoms. So what causes damage to the intestinal lining? A lot is still unknown about how hyperpermeability or leaky gut syndrome can come about, but some of the main factors that increase the risk are excessive alcohol intake. Alcohol damages the gut lining. Also, NSAIDs, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, like ibuprofen or naproxen or any of those kind of anti-inflammatory medications, they seem to have a very detrimental effect on tight junctions. So taking one once in a while is fine. We can regenerate ourselves and when we're healthy, but if someone's taking them all the time chronically, you're going to have gut lining damage. The other thing is sugar, eating too much sugar, because this helps promote the growth of yeast rather than our healthy gut bacteria, and yeast can damage our gut lining. The other thing is infections. So sometimes when we don't produce enough hydrochloric acid, then pathogenic organisms don't get killed in the stomach, and then they can also damage our intestine. You're more likely to get food poisoning, for example. Well, let's suppose it's not really rotten food. Let's suppose it's moderately old food that has bacteria, right? Two people can eat the same meal and one could get food poisoning and one won't. Why does that happen? The primary reason is the amount of hydrochloric acid produced. When you have a normal, healthy amount of hydrochloric acid, that helps kill pathogens. So if those pathogens survive, then they can damage the gut lining as well. And then the last thing I want to mention is stress. When we have excessive stress, that stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, which causes the blood flow to the digestive tract to decrease, which decreases nutrients that are going to the intestinal cells, which decreases their ability to regenerate. So if you are constantly stressed, you have a constant decrease in blood flow to the digestive tract, and it's very difficult for the digestive tract to heal itself. So when the digestive tract has inflammation, it's going to affect inflammation in the whole rest of your body. So people that have chronic inflammatory conditions like heart disease or diabetes or cancer or autoimmune diseases, when your gut lining is not healthy, those conditions will be worse. So take care of your digestive system.